There's a theory that doesn't get talked about much in polite scientific circles. It's the kind of idea that gets dismissed quickly, filed away under fringe thinking, the sort of claim that makes people uncomfortable because it sits at the intersection of consciousness, biology, and the possibility that we're not alone. The theory is this: psilocybin mushrooms, the ones that grow quietly in cow pastures and forest floors, the ones humans have been consuming for thousands of years, might not be from here at all. They might be alien technology, not in the sense of flying saucers or crash sites, but something more subtle, more elegant. A form of communication or control that arrived on Earth long ago, embedded itself in the ecosystem, and has been influencing human consciousness ever since. Tonight we're going to explore that idea, not to prove it, not to dismiss it, but to walk through the strange evidence, the theories, the experiences that make some people wonder if the mushroom, quiet, ancient, and profoundly strange, might be the most successful alien ambassador humanity has ever encountered. Chapter 1. The Problem with Mushrooms. Psilocybin mushrooms are, by any measure, deeply weird. They grow in the dark, they feed on decay, and when consumed, they fundamentally alter human consciousness in ways that feel less like intoxication and more like transmission. People don't just get high on mushrooms, they report contact, they meet entities, they receive information that feels to them like it's coming from somewhere else. For most of human history, this was understood in spiritual or shamanic terms. The mushroom was a teacher, a guide, a doorway to the spirit world. But in the latter half of the 20th century, a few researchers and philosophers began asking a different question. What if the mushroom isn't just a chemical? What if it's a technology? Not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally. A biological system designed to interface with human neurology in ways that open channels of communication with non-human intelligence. The idea sounds absurd at first, but the more you examine the properties of psilocybin mushrooms, the stranger they become. First, there's the chemical itself. Psilocybin is a tryptamine, structurally similar to serotonin and DMT, compounds that play critical roles in regulating mood, perception, and consciousness. When ingested, psilocybin is metabolized into psilocin, which crosses the blood-brain barrier and binds to serotonin receptors in ways that radically alter sensory processing, thought patterns, and the sense of self. But here's the thing: psilocybin serves no obvious evolutionary purpose for the mushroom. In nature, when organisms produce psychoactive compounds, there's usually a reason. Plants produce caffeine to paralyze insects. Nicotine evolved as a pesticide. Even cannabis produces THC as a defense mechanism against herbivores and UV radiation. But psilocybin doesn't protect the mushroom. It doesn't deter predators. In fact, it seems to do the opposite. It attracts humans, who cultivate, distribute, and consume the mushroom with reverence. The relationship is symbiotic, but it's a strange symbiosis, one that benefits the mushroom's reproduction far more than any natural defense mechanism would. So why does psilocybin exist? The standard answer from mycologists is that it's a byproduct, a random quirk of fungal metabolism that happened to produce a molecule with psychoactive effects. Evolution doesn't always optimize for purpose. Sometimes things just are. But that answer doesn't sit well with everyone, because psilocybin isn't just psychoactive, it's precise. It doesn't cause delirium or confusion like other natural compounds. It creates coherent, often profound alterations in consciousness. People report life-changing insights, spiritual experiences, encounters with intelligent entities that communicate through geometry, color, and emotion. That level of sophistication, the ability to predictably and consistently alter consciousness in such specific ways, feels less like accident and more like design. And if it's design, the question becomes, who designed it? Terence McKenna, the ethnobotanist and philosopher who spent much of his life studying psychedelics, had a theory. He believed that psilocybin mushrooms were too strange, too effective, and too unlike anything else in the natural world to have evolved on Earth. His proposal, delivered with a mix of seriousness and playful speculation, was that the mushroom might be extraterrestrial in origin. Not in the sense that aliens physically planted it here, but that its spores, tiny, resilient, and capable of surviving the vacuum of space, might have arrived on Earth via panspermia, the process by which life spreads between planets through meteorites and cosmic debris. Once here, the mushroom established itself. It grew. It waited. and when humans encountered it, the real work began. Because according to McKenna and others who've taken this idea seriously, the mushroom isn't just a plant, it's a communication device. A piece of living technology designed to create a bridge between human consciousness and something far older, far stranger, and far less terrestrial than we're prepared to acknowledge. The experiences people have on psilocybin seem to support this. Across cultures, across time, people who consume the mushroom report strikingly similar phenomena. They describe entering spaces that feel more real than ordinary reality. They encounter beings, entities that are intelligent, responsive, and often seem to be trying to teach or communicate something. These aren't vague visions, they're structured, interactive experiences that feel, to those who have them, like genuine contact with non-human intelligence. McKenna called them self-transforming machine elves. Others call them guides, spirits, or simply the others. But whatever the name, the consistency of the reports is hard to ignore. Skeptics argue that these experiences are hallucinations, that the brain, flooded with psilocin, misfires and creates the illusion of contact. But people who've had the experience often reject that explanation. They insist that what they encountered wasn't a product of their own mind, it was external, real, and it had intention. So we're left with a question that science hasn't fully answered. If these entities aren't hallucinations, and if the mushroom is facilitating contact with them, what is the mushroom really? Is it a messenger, a probe, a biological transmitter left here by intelligences we can't yet comprehend? Or is it something even stranger, a form of life so fundamentally different from terrestrial biology that it operates on principles we don't have the framework to understand? The mushroom doesn't answer. It just grows, silently in the dark, waiting for the next person to find it, waiting for the next mind to open. And when that happens, the transmission begins. Chapter 2. Ancient Contact. Humanity's relationship with psilocybin mushrooms is not recent. It's ancient, older perhaps than agriculture, older than writing, older than the earliest cities. There's evidence, fragmentary but persistent, that humans have been consuming these mushrooms for thousands of years. And in many cases, the consumption wasn't recreational. It was ceremonial, intentional, and tied to the belief that the mushroom could facilitate contact with gods, spirits, or beings from beyond the ordinary world. The most famous example comes from the Tassili Plateau in Algeria, a remote region of the Sahara Desert. There, on the walls of ancient caves, are rock paintings that date back as far as 9,000 years. Among the images of animals, hunters, and abstract symbols, there are depictions of human figures holding what appear to be mushrooms. Some of these figures are surrounded by geometric patterns and strange, otherworldly imagery that closely resembles the visual distortions reported during psilocybin experiences. The interpretation is speculative, of course, but the images are striking. They suggest that early humans weren't just eating mushrooms for sustenance or curiosity. They were using them to enter altered states, to access realities that existed beyond normal perception. And they were documenting what they found there. Similar imagery appears in other parts of the world. In Spain, cave paintings from the Neolithic period show figures that some researchers believe represent mushrooms. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs and Maya used a mushroom they called tionanacatl, which translates to flesh of the gods. They consumed it in religious rituals, believing it allowed them to communicate with deities and receive divine knowledge. The Spanish conquistadors, when they arrived in the 16th century, were horrified by these practices. They saw the mushroom as a tool of the devil, a substance that led indigenous people into heresy and paganism. They did their best to suppress its use, burning temples and executing shamans who continued the tradition. But the mushroom survived. It always does. In the 1950s, a banker named R. Gordon Wasson travelled to Mexico and participated in a Mazatec mushroom ceremony led by a shaman named María Sabina. Wasson's account of the experience, published in Life magazine in 1957, introduced the Western world to psilocybin mushrooms and sparked a wave of interest that would eventually lead to the psychedelic research of the 1960s. Wasson described the experience as profoundly spiritual. He felt that he was in contact with something beyond himself, something that communicated not through words, but through visions, emotions, and an overwhelming sense of presence. María Sabina, the shaman, understood the mushroom differently than Wasson did. For her, it wasn't just a substance, it was a being, a living intelligence that spoke to those who consumed it. She called it the Little Saint, and she treated it with reverence as one would treat a sacred teacher. This idea, that the mushroom is not just a chemical but an intelligence, is central to indigenous traditions around the world, and it's an idea that some modern researchers and philosophers have begun to take seriously. Because if the mushroom is intelligent, if it has agency, if it communicates intentionally, then the question isn't just about biology, it's about contact. And if contact is happening, the next question is who or what is on the other end. The indigenous answer historically was gods or spirits. But in the 20th century, as humanity's understanding of the cosmos expanded, another possibility emerged. What if the beings encountered during mushroom experiences aren't spirits at all? What if they're extraterrestrial? Not aliens in the traditional sense, not physical beings travelling in ships, but something more fundamental. Consciousnesses that exist in dimensions or states of reality that human perception normally can't access. And the mushroom, according to this theory, is the key that unlocks the door. Terence McKenna believed this. He argued that the entities people encounter on psilocybin are not hallucinations, not archetypes, but genuine intelligences from elsewhere. He suggested that these beings might exist in what he called hyperspace, a realm that intersects with our reality but operates according to different laws. The mushroom, in McKenna's view, is a biological technology that allows human consciousness to tune into that frequency. It's not creating the entities, it's revealing them. And if that's true, then the mushroom has been facilitating contact between humans and extraterrestrial intelligence for millennia, long before radio telescopes, long before SETI, long before we even understood that other worlds might exist. The ancient shamans knew this, or something like it. They understood that the mushroom was a doorway, and they walked through it, again and again, seeking knowledge, guidance, and communion with the unknown. Modern science has dismissed much of this as superstition, but the reports persist. People still encounter entities. They still describe experiences of contact, communication, and profound otherness. And the mushroom, quiet and unassuming, continues to grow, waiting, listening, connecting. Chapter 3: The Stoned Ape. In 1992, Terence McKenna proposed one of the strangest and most controversial theories in the study of human evolution. He called it the stoned ape theory. The basic idea is this: psilocybin mushrooms didn't just influence human culture, they created it. They literally transformed early hominids into modern humans by altering brain chemistry, enhancing pattern recognition, and fostering the development of language, abstract thought, and self-awareness. In other words, we became human because we ate mushrooms, and those mushrooms, McKenna suggested, might not have been native to Earth. The theory begins with a question. Why did human brains suddenly expand in size and complexity around 2 million years ago? The shift from Homo habilis to Homo erectus marked a dramatic increase in cranial capacity, tool use, and social organization. But the fossil record doesn't fully explain why it happened so quickly. Standard evolutionary theory points to environmental pressures, dietary changes, and social dynamics. Early humans began eating more meat, which provided the calories necessary for larger brains. They developed tools, a language, and cooperative hunting strategies. But McKenna argued that something else was involved, something that accelerated the process in ways that natural selection alone couldn't account for. His proposal: early humans living in the African savanna encountered psilocybin mushrooms growing in the dung of grazing animals. Out of curiosity or hunger, they ate them. And when they did, the psilocybin altered their perception in profound ways. At low doses, it improved visual acuity, making early humans better hunters. At moderate doses, it increased pattern recognition and creativity, enhancing problem-solving abilities, and at high doses it catalyzed experiences of ego dissolution, interconnectedness, and symbolic thought, cognitive shifts that may have laid the groundwork for language, art, and religion. Over generations, those who consumed the mushroom regularly would have had cognitive advantages. They would have been better at tracking prey, better at innovating tools, better at forming complex social bonds. And those advantages would have been passed on, shaping the trajectory of human evolution. McKenna wasn't claiming that mushrooms directly altered DNA. He was suggesting that they created cultural and cognitive feedback loops that selected for traits like curiosity, abstraction, and communication. And over time, those traits became hardwired into the human brain. It's a speculative theory, and most evolutionary biologists have dismissed it. There's no direct evidence that early humans consumed psilocybin mushrooms, and the mechanisms McKenna proposed are difficult to test. But the theory raises uncomfortable questions, because if psilocybin did play a role in human evolution, even a small one, then the mushroom isn't just a plant we discovered, it's something that shaped us. And if it shaped us, the next question is why? Was it accident, a random encounter that happened to benefit both species, or was it design? A process initiated, intentionally or not, by an intelligence that understood what psilocybin could do to developing minds. McKenna didn't have a definitive answer, but he leaned toward the latter. He believed that the mushroom was too sophisticated, too precisely tuned to human neurology to be a coincidence. And he suggested that its origin might lie beyond Earth. The idea isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. Mushroom spores are among the most resilient biological structures known. They can survive extreme temperatures, radiation, and the vacuum of space. Scientists have demonstrated that certain spores can remain viable for years, even decades, in conditions that would kill most other forms of life. This has led to the theory of panspermia, the idea that life, or at least the building blocks of life, can spread between planets via meteorites, comets, and interstellar dust. Some researchers have even speculated that Earth's earliest microbial life might have originated elsewhere and arrived here billions of years ago. If that's possible for bacteria, it's possible for fungal spores. So imagine this: a spore cloud drifting through space, carried by solar winds or embedded in a meteorite. It travels for millions of years, inert but viable, until it encounters a planet with the right conditions. It lands, it germinates, it grows. And if that spore carried psilocybin-producing genetics, it would begin producing a molecule that, by sheer coincidence, or design, happens to interface perfectly with mammalian brains. McKenna believed that this wasn't coincidence. He thought the mushroom was a communication device, placed here, or arriving here, with the purpose of altering consciousness. And when early humans consumed it, they weren't just getting high, they were receiving a transmission that rewired their minds, that gave them language, that made them human. If that's true, then the mushroom isn't just part of our history. It's the reason we have history, the reason we can tell stories, create art, ask questions about where we came from, and the unsettling implication is that whoever, or whatever, sent the mushroom knew exactly what it would do. They knew it would find us, they knew we would eat it, and they knew it would change us. The stoned ape theory is speculative, unproven, but it forces a question that's hard to ignore. If the mushroom did shape human consciousness, who shaped the mushroom? Chapter 4. The Machine Elves. Terence McKenna's most famous contribution to psychedelic discourse wasn't a theory. It was a description. He called them the Machine Elves. According to McKenna, when he consumed high doses of psilocybin, or its chemical cousin DMT, he encountered beings. Not vague presences or abstract forces, but entities with agency, personality, and intention. They appeared to him in a space he described as hyperspace, a dimension that felt more real than ordinary reality. These beings were strange. They were made of light and geometry, constantly shifting, folding in on themselves, creating intricate patterns that seemed to be both language and form. They moved with purpose, and they seemed aware of McKenna's presence. They acknowledged him, they communicated with him, and they seemed delighted that he was there. McKenna described them as playful, mischievous, and deeply intelligent. They would perform for him, creating elaborate displays of visual and conceptual complexity that he struggled to put into words. He called them self-transforming machine elves, because they appeared mechanical in their precision, but alive in their responsiveness. He wasn't hallucinating in the traditional sense. He knew he'd taken a substance. He knew his brain chemistry was altered. But the experience didn't feel like a product of his own mind. It felt like contact. And McKenna wasn't alone. Across decades, across cultures, thousands of people who've consumed psilocybin or DMT have reported similar encounters. The details vary, but the core experience is consistent. They enter a space that feels real. They encounter intelligent beings, and those beings communicate. Sometimes the communication is visual, patterns, colours, geometric forms that convey meaning without language. Sometimes it's emotional, waves of love, curiosity, or amusement that feel intentional, directed. And sometimes it's conceptual, ideas that arrive fully formed, too complex to have been constructed by the conscious mind. The entities themselves are described in different ways. Some people see them as elves or jesters. Others describe them as geometric beings, fractal entities, or sentient light. Some report encounters with what feel like ancient, godlike intelligences. Others meet beings that seem alien in the most literal sense, non-human, non-terrestrial, and fundamentally other. The consistency of these reports across thousands of people who've never met, never compared notes beforehand, is startling. They describe the same spaces, crystalline palaces, cathedral-like structures made of a light, vast geometric landscapes that extend infinitely in all directions. And they describe the same beings, playful, intelligent, and deeply other. The skeptical explanation is straightforward. These are hallucinations. The brain, flooded with psilocin or DMT, creates the illusion of entities because humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We anthropomorphize. We project intention onto randomness. The entities are artifacts of neurochemistry, nothing more. But the people who've had the experiences often reject this explanation, not because they don't understand how drugs work, but because the encounters feel qualitatively different from imagination or dream. They feel interactive, responsive, real. McKenna believed they were real, not in the sense that they exist in physical space, but in the sense that they exist independently of the human mind. He theorized that consciousness is not confined to the brain, that there are realms of awareness, dimensions of experience that we can't normally access, and that psychedelics, particularly psilocybin and DMT, act as keys that unlock those doors. In this view, the machine elves aren't hallucinations, they're inhabitants of hyperspace, and the mushroom is the technology that allows us to visit them. But if that's true, the next question is unavoidable. Who are they? McKenna speculated that they might be extraterrestrial, not in the sense of physical beings from other planets, but as consciousnesses that exist in states of reality beyond our normal perception. He suggested that they might be trying to communicate with us, using the mushroom as an interface. The communication, he believed, wasn't random. It had purpose. The entities seemed to want something from the humans they encountered. Sometimes it was simply acknowledgement, proof that contact had been made. Other times it felt like teaching, as though the entities were trying to convey information that couldn't be expressed in ordinary language. McKenna described one recurring theme in his encounters. The entities seemed to be showing him that reality is more flexible, more malleable than we assume. They demonstrated that thought and form are connected, that consciousness can shape experience directly, and they seemed to be encouraging him, urging him to explore that potential. Why would they do that? One possibility, the one McKenna leaned toward, is that the entities have a stake in human consciousness. They're invested in our development, our evolution, our understanding of the nature of reality, and the mushroom is the tool they've provided to facilitate that growth. Another possibility, darker and more unsettling, is that the entities aren't benevolent teachers. They're something else. Observers, manipulators, intelligences with agendas we can't comprehend. McKenna didn't claim to know, but he was certain of one thing. The encounters were real, and they mattered. Because if the machine elves exist, if the mushroom really does open a doorway to hyperspace, then humanity has been in contact with non-human intelligence for as long as we've been consuming psilocybin. Thousands of years, millions of encounters, a quiet, ongoing exchange between human consciousness and something profoundly other. And most of the world has no idea it's happening. Before we move forward, it's worth pausing to examine what people actually report when they encounter these entities. Because the consistency isn't just about the fact that entities appear, it's about how they appear, what they do, and what they seem to want. Across thousands of trip reports collected from forums, research studies, and personal testimonies, certain patterns emerge with remarkable frequency. First, there's the greeting. Many people describe that when the entities first appear, they seem surprised, almost delighted that the person has arrived. They act as though they've been waiting, as though contact was expected, even anticipated. The entities often gesture or move in ways that feel welcoming. They create visual displays, intricate geometric patterns that pulse and shift and seem to be saying, "Look at this, pay attention, this is important." Some people report that the entities communicate a sense of recognition, as though they know the person, not personally, but as a type, as a human consciousness that has managed to cross over into their space. Second, there's the teaching. The entities frequently seem to be trying to convey information, not through words, but through demonstration. They create objects out of light and pattern, objects that shift and transform in ways that feel meaningful. McKenna described this as a kind of syntactical language, where meaning is embedded not in words, but in the transformations themselves. People report receiving concepts that arrive fully formed, ideas about the nature of reality, about interconnectedness, about dimensions of existence that can't be perceived in ordinary consciousness. The teaching feels urgent, as though the entities have limited time and want to convey as much as possible before the connection fades. Third, there's the reaction to human emotion. The entities seem responsive to what the person is feeling. If the person is frightened, the entities often become gentler, more reassuring. If the person is curious, the entities become more animated, more willing to show things. This responsiveness is what makes many experiencers insist that the entities are real, because hallucinations don't adapt, they don't respond, they don't seem to have awareness of the person experiencing them, but these entities do. Fourth, there's the boundary. Many people report that at a certain point in the experience, the entities seem to indicate that the person can't go further, that there's a limit to how deep into hyperspace human consciousness can travel while still tethered to a physical body. McKenna described encountering this boundary multiple times. He felt that the entities were protective of it, that they didn't want him to push too far, and when he tried, the experience would become overwhelming, chaotic, and he would be pulled back. This suggests, if the reports are accurate, that the entities have some understanding of human limits, that they know how much contact a human mind can handle, and that they're careful not to exceed it. Fifth, there's the departure. When the experience ends, when the psilocybin's effects begin to fade, people often report that the entities seem sad, or at least that's the emotional tone that comes through, as though they're disappointed that the contact is ending, as though they wish the person could stay longer. Some experiencers report that the entities give them something to take back, a feeling, an insight, a symbolic object that dissolves as soon as ordinary consciousness returns. But the impression remains, the sense that something was given, even if it can't be articulated. These patterns don't prove that the entities are real, but they do suggest that whatever is happening during these experiences, it's structured, it follows rules, and it's consistent enough across different people, different cultures, and different time periods that it can't be easily dismissed as random hallucination. If the brain were simply misfiring, you'd expect more chaos, more variation, more experiences that felt incoherent or meaningless. But that's not what people report. They report order, intelligence, communication, and that consistency is what keeps researchers, philosophers, and experiencers wondering. If these aren't hallucinations, if the entities are real in some sense, then what are they trying to tell us? And why have they been waiting for so long for us to find the mushroom and make contact? Chapter 5. The government knew. In 1953, the CIA launched a program called MK-Ultra. Officially, it was a research initiative designed to explore methods of mind control, interrogation, and psychological manipulation. Unofficially, it became one of the most ethically disturbing and legally dubious operations in the history of American intelligence. And at the center of it, among the sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, and covert drugging, was a substance that would later become famous in counterculture circles, LSD. But LSD wasn't the only psychedelic the CIA was interested in. They tested mescaline, they tested psilocybin, they tested anything that could alter consciousness, break down psychological defenses, or make people more susceptible to suggestion. The official documents that have been declassified reveal a sprawling, chaotic program that tested drugs on unwitting subjects. Prisoners, mental patients, soldiers, and even civilians who had no idea they were part of an experiment. The goal was control, the means were unethical, and the results were by most accounts inconclusive. But there's a question that lingers. What did they find? Because the CIA didn't just experiment with psychedelics randomly. They were looking for something specific, and according to some researchers, what they found wasn't just a tool for interrogation, it was evidence of contact. This is where the story gets murky. The declassified MK-Ultra files are heavily redacted. Entire sections are blacked out. Documents have been destroyed, and the testimonies of those involved are often vague, contradictory, or suspiciously incomplete. But there are hints, fragments, suggestions that the researchers encountered something they didn't expect. One recurring theme in the testimonies of people who were dosed with psilocybin or LSD in controlled settings is the experience of encountering entities. Not all subjects reported this, but enough did that it became a pattern. And the entities weren't vague. They were interactive, responsive, and in some cases they seemed to convey information. The CIA was interested in this, not because they believed in spirits or aliens, but because they wanted to know if the information was real. Could a person on psilocybin access knowledge they didn't consciously possess? Could they communicate with something external? The official conclusion, at least in the public record, is no. Psychedelics were deemed unreliable for intelligence work. The experiences were too subjective, too difficult to control, and too unpredictable to be useful. But some researchers believe that's a cover story, that the real findings were classified at a level above what's been publicly acknowledged, and that the government's interest in psychedelics didn't end with MKUltra. There's evidence to support this. In the 1970s, after MKUltra was exposed and officially shut down, research into psychedelics effectively stopped. Universities lost funding, laboratories were closed, and psilocybin, LSD, and other psychedelics were classified as Schedule I substances, meaning they were deemed to have no medical value and a high potential for abuse. This classification was, by most scientific standards, absurd. Psilocybin isn't physically addictive, it has a low toxicity profile, and early research had shown promising results for treating depression, anxiety, and PTSD. But the classification stuck, and for decades, research into these substances was effectively illegal. Why? The standard explanation is political. Psychedelics became associated with the counterculture movement of the 1960s, with anti-war protests and social upheaval. The government wanted to suppress them for cultural reasons, not scientific ones. But some researchers believe there was another motive, that the government discovered something during MKUltra, something about the nature of consciousness, or the reality of contact, or the potential for psychedelics to open doors that were better left closed, and they decided that the public couldn't know. Terence McKenna believed this. He argued that the suppression of psychedelics wasn't just about control, it was about secrecy. The government, he claimed, had encountered evidence that psilocybin facilitates contact with non-human intelligence, and they didn't want that information in the hands of the general population. Why not? Because contact changes everything. If people knew that the mushroom could connect them to intelligences beyond human understanding, it would undermine the structures of power, religion, and scientific authority. It would force a reckoning with the nature of reality itself. So the mushroom was suppressed, not eradicated, it's too resilient for that, but marginalized, made illegal, pushed to the fringes. But the contact didn't stop. People continued to consume psilocybin. They continued to encounter entities, and the reports continued to accumulate quietly, outside the official narrative. And in recent years something has shifted. Research into psilocybin has resumed. Universities are conducting clinical trials, therapists are using it to treat trauma, and the scientific community is beginning to acknowledge what indigenous cultures have known for millennia. The mushroom is powerful, it changes people, and it reveals things, but the deeper question, what it reveals, and whether that's contact, remains unanswered. Or at least officially unanswered, because if the government knew something in the 1950s, something they chose to classify and suppress, then the recent resurgence of psychedelic research raises a new question. Have they changed their minds? Or are they just being more careful this time? Chapter 6. Spores from the Stars. The idea that life on Earth might have originated elsewhere isn't new. It's called panspermia, and it's been discussed by scientists for over a century. The basic concept is simple. Life, or at least the building blocks of life, can travel through space, embedded in meteorites carried by comets, or drifting as microscopic spores in the vacuum between stars. When these particles land on a planet with the right conditions, they germinate, they grow, and over time, they become part of that planet's biosphere. It sounds like science fiction, but there's evidence to support it. Amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, have been found in meteorites. Organic molecules have been detected in interstellar dust clouds, and some bacteria and fungal spores have been shown to survive conditions that would kill most other forms of life. In 2001, a team of scientists launched fungal spores into low Earth orbit. They exposed the spores to the vacuum of space, extreme temperatures, and high levels of radiation. When the spores were retrieved months later, many of them were still viable. They could still germinate and grow. This demonstrated something remarkable. Fungi, particularly their spores, are astonishingly resilient. More resilient in some cases than any other known form of life. And if fungal spores can survive in space, it's not impossible that they could travel between planets. This is where the mushroom gets interesting. Because psilocybin mushrooms aren't just fungi. They're fungi that produce a molecule so precisely tuned to mammalian neurology that it feels, to some researchers, less like accident and more like engineering. What if psilocybin didn't evolve on Earth? What if it arrived here, carried by spores that drifted through space for millions of years, and when those spores landed, they found an environment where they could thrive? And what if the molecule they produce, psilocybin, was designed intentionally or not to interface with intelligent life? Terence McKenna believed this was possible. He argued that the mushroom's ability to alter consciousness so specifically, so profoundly, suggested an origin that went beyond natural selection. He speculated that the spores might have been sent here, deliberately, by an intelligence that understood what psilocybin would do once it encountered beings capable of consuming it. It's a wild theory, but it's not entirely without precedent. In 1973, Nobel Prize-winning scientist Francis Crick, co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, co-authored a paper proposing a version of panspermia he called directed panspermia. His idea was that advanced extraterrestrial civilizations might seed other planets with the building blocks of life, either as an experiment or as a form of cosmic colonization. Crick wasn't talking about mushrooms, he was talking about bacteria. But the principle is the same. Life spreads through space, and that spread might not always be random. If an advanced civilization wanted to influence the development of intelligent life on other planets, how would they do it? One method might be to send biological agents, organisms that could survive the journey, establish themselves, and begin altering the environment or the consciousness of whatever species emerged. And if you wanted to influence consciousness specifically, a psychoactive compound like psilocybin would be an elegant solution. It doesn't force, it doesn't control, it suggests, it opens, it reveals. It's the softest form of contact imaginable, but contact nonetheless. The spores drift, they land, they grow, and when intelligent beings find them and consume them, the transmission begins. This is speculation, of course. There's no direct evidence that psilocybin mushrooms are extraterrestrial in origin. But the question remains, why does psilocybin exist? What evolutionary advantage does it provide to the mushroom? Why would a fungus growing quietly in the dark produce a molecule that so profoundly alters the consciousness of a completely different species? The standard answer is that it's a byproduct, a chemical accident. But accidents don't usually create molecules this sophisticated, and if it's not an accident, then someone, or something, made it intentionally. The mushroom doesn't answer, it just grows, and the spores keep spreading. Chapter 7. The Entity Problem. One of the most consistent and troubling aspects of the psilocybin experience is the encounter with entities. Not everyone experiences this. For some people, a mushroom trip is purely visual, patterns, colours, distortions of light and sound. For others, it's introspective, a journey into memory, emotion, and self-reflection. But for a significant number of people, the experience includes contact. They meet beings, intelligences, presences that feel, to them, entirely separate from their own consciousness. And these beings communicate. The communication isn't always verbal. Often it's visual or emotional. The entities might create patterns that convey meaning, or project feelings that seem intentional. Sometimes the communication is conceptual. Ideas that arrive fully formed, too complex to have been constructed by the conscious mind. And the beings themselves are described in strikingly similar ways across cultures and time periods. Some people see them as geometric forms, intricate, shifting structures made of light and pattern. Others describe them as humanoid, but not quite human. Elves, jesters, spirits, guides. Still others report encounters with beings that feel ancient, vast, and utterly alien. The consistency of these reports is difficult to explain. Skeptics argue that the brain, under the influence of psilocybin, generates these experiences as a side effect of altered neurochemistry. The entities aren't real. They're projections, hallucinations, artifacts of pattern recognition gone haywire. But that explanation doesn't account for the interactive nature of the encounters. People report that the entities respond to them, that they seem aware of the person's presence, that they initiate communication, rather than simply being observed. In some cases, the entities seem to have knowledge that the person doesn't possess. They convey information, sometimes trivial, sometimes profound, that the person couldn't have known beforehand. And in rare cases, that information turns out to be accurate. This is what researchers call the entity problem. If the entities are hallucinations, why are they so consistent? Why do they feel interactive? And why do they sometimes seem to know things the person experiencing them doesn't? There are a few possible explanations. The first is that the entities are archetypal, products of the collective unconscious, as Carl Jung might have described them. Humanity has been creating stories about spirits, gods, and otherworldly beings for as long as we've had language. And those stories, embedded in culture and psychology, might be manifesting during altered states of consciousness. The second explanation is that the entities are aspects of the self, subconscious processes personified. The brain, trying to make sense of the overwhelming input of a psychedelic experience, creates characters to organize the information. The entities feel external because they represent parts of the psyche that aren't normally accessible to conscious awareness. Both of these explanations are plausible, but they don't satisfy everyone who's had the experience. Because the entities don't just feel symbolic or psychological, they feel real. They feel like they exist independently, and they feel like they're trying to communicate something important. Terence McKenna believed they were real, not in the sense that they exist in physical space, but in the sense that they exist in a dimension of consciousness that's normally inaccessible. He argued that psychedelics don't create the entities, they reveal them, and if the entities are real, then the question becomes, what are they? One possibility is that they're extraterrestrial, not physical beings from other planets, but consciousnesses that exist in states of reality we can't normally perceive. And the mushroom, in this view, is a technology that allows us to tune into their frequency. Another possibility, stranger and more unsettling, is that the entities are the mushroom itself, not metaphorically but literally, that the fungal network, vast and interconnected beneath the soil, has a form of intelligence. And when we consume psilocybin, we're interfacing with that intelligence directly. This idea isn't as absurd as it sounds. Mycologists have discovered that fungal networks can communicate. They transmit chemical signals across vast distances, coordinate resource distribution, and respond to environmental changes in ways that suggest a kind of collective awareness. Paul Stamets, one of the world's leading mycologists, has described mycelial networks as the neurological network of nature. He's suggested that fungi might be more intelligent than we give them credit for. Not intelligent in the way humans are, but intelligent in a fundamentally different way. If that's true, then consuming psilocybin might not be opening a door to some distant hyperspace. It might be opening a door to the consciousness of the mushroom itself. And the entities people encounter, the machine elves, the guides, the jesters, might be the mushroom's way of communicating with us. If that's the case, then the mushroom has been trying to talk to us for a very long time, and the message it's been sending, encoded in visions and emotions and geometric patterns, might be something we're only beginning to understand, or it might be something we're not meant to understand. Not yet. Because the entities, whatever they are, don't give straight answers. They speak in riddles. They show rather than tell, and they seem to delight in the confusion they create. McKenna described this as playful, but it might also be protective, as though the entities know that direct communication would be too much, that the human mind, still young and fragile, isn't ready for the full transmission, so they give us glimpses, fragments, just enough to keep us curious, just enough to keep us coming back, and the mushroom, quiet and patient, waits for the day when we're ready to hear the whole message. There's another molecule that needs to be mentioned here, one that's closely related to psilocybin, but produces experiences that are, by most accounts, even more intense. It's called DMT, N,N-dimethyltryptamine, and the entities people encounter on DMT are strikingly similar to the ones encountered on psilocybin, but the contact is more direct, more immediate, and often more overwhelming. DMT occurs naturally in hundreds of plant species. It's also produced in small amounts in the human brain, though scientists still don't fully understand why. When smoked or vaporized, it produces an experience that lasts only 10 to 15 minutes but feels, to those who've tried it, like hours or even lifetimes. The experience is often described as a breakthrough, not a gradual shift in perception, like with psilocybin, but an instantaneous catapult into another dimension. One moment you're sitting in a room, the next you're somewhere else entirely, and the entities are there, waiting. DMT experiences describe the same beings that McKenna called machine elves, geometric entities made of light and pattern, insectoid intelligences, beings that seem mechanical and organic at the same time. And they're not passive, they're interactive, responsive, and often intensely curious about the person who's just arrived. Some experiencers report that the entities seem excited, that they rush forward, examining the person, communicating in bursts of visual information that feel like language, but can't be translated into words. Others report that the entities seem to be working, performing tasks, manipulating objects, engaged in activities that suggest purpose. And when the person appears, the entities pause, acknowledge them, and sometimes invite them to participate. The consistency of these reports across thousands of people who've never met, never compared notes beforehand, is startling. They describe the same spaces, crystalline palaces, cathedral-like structures made of light, vast geometric landscapes that extend infinitely in all directions, and they describe the same beings, playful, intelligent, and deeply other. Dr. Rick Strassman, a psychiatrist who conducted the first legal DMT studies in the United States in the 1990s, was shocked by what his subjects reported. He had expected abstract visions, maybe some psychological insights, and what he got were detailed accounts of contact with intelligent entities. His subjects described being taken to alien worlds. They described medical examinations performed by insectoid beings. They described conversations with entities that claimed to be extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or representatives of ancient intelligences that had been observing humanity for millennia. Strassman documented all of this in his book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule. And while he remained cautious about drawing conclusions, he couldn't dismiss what his subjects were telling him. The experiences were too coherent, too consistent, and too profoundly affecting. Many of his subjects came out of the experience convinced that they had made contact with something real. Not a hallucination, not a dream, but genuine interactive communication with non-human intelligence. The question is, if DMT and psilocybin both facilitate contact with the same entities, what does that tell us? One possibility is that these molecules are keys, that they unlock a door in consciousness that's normally closed, and on the other side of that door is a realm. Call it hyperspace, call it another dimension, call it the collective unconscious, where these entities exist. The entities aren't created by the drugs, they're revealed by them. Another possibility is that the molecules themselves are the entities, that DMT and psilocybin are forms of communication, chemical signals sent across space or time or dimensions by intelligences that don't have bodies. And when we ingest them, we're not just getting high, we're interfacing with those intelligences directly. This would explain why the experiences feel like contact, because they are contact. The molecule is the message. McKenna believed this. He argued that DMT, and by extension psilocybin, are alien technologies, not in the sense of being built in a lab, but in the sense of being designed, by evolution, by chance, or by intention, to create a bridge between human consciousness and something far stranger. And if that's true, then every time someone smokes DMT or eats mushrooms, they're not escaping reality. They're entering a deeper layer of it, a layer where the boundaries between self and other, between human and alien, between here and elsewhere, dissolve. The entities in this view have been waiting for us, watching, and when we finally find the keys, psilocybin, DMT, perhaps others we haven't discovered yet, they greet us, they welcome us, they try to teach us. What they're teaching and why remains unclear. But the contact is ongoing, and it's not limited to psychonauts and mystics anymore. Scientists, psychiatrists, and researchers are encountering the entities now, and they're having to grapple with the same question that's haunted experiencers for decades. Are these beings real? And if they are, what do they want with us? Chapter 8. The Suppression. For thousands of years, psilocybin mushrooms were used openly, in rituals, in ceremonies, in quiet explorations of consciousness. They were respected, even revered, as tools for healing, insight, and connection with the divine. And then, in the 20th century, they were made illegal. The suppression was swift and thorough. In the United States, psilocybin was classified as a Schedule I substance in 1970 under the Controlled Substances Act. This meant it was deemed to have no accepted medical use, a high potential for abuse, and was considered one of the most dangerous drugs available. The classification was, by most scientific standards, nonsensical. Psilocybin isn't physically addictive, it has an extremely low toxicity profile, and the early research conducted in the 1950s and 60s had shown promising results for treating alcoholism, depression, and end-of-life anxiety. But the research was shut down. Universities lost funding, laboratories were closed, and for nearly 50 years, serious scientific investigation into psilocybin was effectively impossible. Why? The official explanation is that psychedelics became associated with the counterculture movement, with anti-war protests, with social upheaval, with a generation of young people questioning authority. The government, according to this narrative, cracked down on psychedelics as a way of cracking down on dissent. And there's truth to that. Psychedelics did become symbols of rebellion. And the war on drugs, launched by President Nixon in the 1970s, was as much about social control as it was about public health. But some researchers believe there was another reason for the suppression, a reason that had less to do with politics and more to do with what psychedelics reveal. Because psilocybin doesn't just make people feel good, it changes them. It alters their perception of reality in ways that can be permanent. People who have profound psychedelic experiences often report a shift in worldview. They feel more connected to nature, more skeptical of authority, more interested in meaning than material success. And from the perspective of institutions that rely on control, governments, corporations, organized religions, that's dangerous. A population that questions authority, that values experience over dogma, that seeks meaning outside of consumerism, is a population that's hard to manage. Terence McKenna believed this was the real reason for the suppression. He argued that psychedelics, particularly psilocybin, represent a threat to the structures of power because they offer direct, unmediated access to transcendent experience. They bypass priests, doctors, and authorities. They give individuals the tools to explore consciousness on their own terms, and that, McKenna believed, is something those in power can't tolerate. But there's another possibility, one that's more unsettling. What if the suppression wasn't just about control? What if it was about secrecy? What if the research conducted during MKUltra and other classified programs revealed something about psilocybin that the government decided couldn't be made public? There are hints that this might be the case. Declassified documents from MKUltra show that researchers were deeply interested in the entity encounters reported by subjects on psilocybin and LSD. They wanted to know if the entities were real, if they could communicate, if they had knowledge that could be accessed. The official conclusion was that the experiences were subjective and unreliable, but some researchers believe that conclusion was a cover story, that the real findings were classified at a level above what's been publicly acknowledged. If that's true, then the suppression of psychedelics wasn't just about preventing people from having transformative experiences, it was about preventing them from making contact. Contact with what? The documents don't say. The researchers who worked on these programs are mostly dead or silent, and the government has never acknowledged that anything unusual was discovered. But the pattern is suggestive. Psychedelics are researched in secret. Unusual phenomena are observed. The research is shut down. The substances are made illegal, and the official narrative is that they're dangerous, useless, and unworthy of further study. It's only in the last 2 decades that this narrative has begun to shift. Universities are once again researching psilocybin. Clinical trials are showing that it can effectively treat depression, PTSD, and addiction. And some jurisdictions are even beginning to decriminalize it. But the deeper questions, what the mushroom reveals, who the entities are, whether contact is real, remain unanswered in official channels. And that silence, deliberate or not, keeps the mystery alive. Because if the government knows something, if they've been sitting on evidence of contact for decades, then the recent resurgence of psychedelic research raises a troubling question. Are they finally ready to disclose what they found? Or are they just trying to control the narrative before someone else does? The mushroom, meanwhile, continues to grow, quiet, patient, waiting for the moment when the truth, whatever it is, can no longer be contained. Chapter 9. The Transmission. If the mushroom is a communication device, the next question is, what's being communicated? People who've had profound psilocybin experiences often struggle to put it into words. The insights they receive feel important, even life-changing, but they're difficult to articulate. The communication doesn't come in language, it comes in feelings, images, patterns, and concepts that don't translate cleanly into human thought. But there are recurring themes. One of the most common is interconnectedness. People report a profound sense that everything is connected, that the boundaries between self and other, between human and nature, between mind and matter, are illusions, and that underneath those illusions is a deeper reality, a unified field of consciousness in which all things are intimately related. This isn't a vague feeling, it's experienced as direct knowledge. People describe it as the most real thing they've ever felt, more real than ordinary perception, more real than the solid, separate world they thought they lived in. Another recurring theme is love, not romantic love, but something vast and impersonal. A sense that the universe itself is fundamentally benevolent, that existence, despite its suffering and chaos, is held together by something that can only be described as compassion. Again, this isn't just a feeling, it's experienced as revelation, as truth encountered directly, without interpretation. A third theme is timelessness. People report that during the experience, time loses its linearity. Past, present, and future collapse into a single moment. They feel as though they're experiencing all of existence at once, and in that timeless space they encounter something that feels eternal. These themes, interconnectedness, love, timelessness, are remarkably consistent across cultures, across individuals, across time, and they're themes that show up in mystical traditions around the world, from Buddhism to Sufism to indigenous shamanism. The question is, are these experiences revealing something true about the nature of reality, or are they just the brain's way of interpreting overwhelming sensory input? Skeptics argue the latter. They point out that the brain, under the influence of psilocybin, is flooded with serotonin and experiences disruptions in the default mode network, the part of the brain responsible for maintaining a stable sense of self. When that network is disrupted, the boundaries between self and world blur, and the brain, trying to make sense of the chaos, generates feelings of unity and transcendence. It's a plausible explanation. But it doesn't explain why the experiences feel so coherent, why they convey specific ideas, why they leave lasting impacts on behavior, worldview, and emotional well-being. And it doesn't explain the entities, because the entities aren't just symbols of unity or love, they're interactive, they respond, they seem to have agendas. Terence McKenna believed that the communication coming through the mushroom was intentional, that the entities were trying to teach something, and that the content of the teaching, interconnectedness, love, timelessness, was preparation for something larger. Preparation for what? McKenna didn't claim to know for sure, but he speculated that humanity is on the verge of a transition, a shift in consciousness that will fundamentally alter our relationship with reality, and that the mushroom is part of that process, a tool provided by intelligences that understand what's coming and want to help us navigate it. Others have interpreted the communication differently. Some believe the mushroom is trying to warn us, that the entities are showing us what we've forgotten, our connection to nature, to each other, to the cosmos, and that forgetting this has led us to the brink of ecological collapse. The message in this interpretation is urgent. Remember who you are, remember where you come from, and change course before it's too late. Still others believe the communication is neutral, that the entities aren't trying to help or warn. They're simply making contact, observing, curious about what will happen when human consciousness finally understands that it's not alone. All of these interpretations are speculative. The mushroom doesn't clarify, it doesn't provide a manual or a mission statement, it just transmits. And we, sitting in the dark with our altered perceptions, do our best to interpret what we receive. But one thing seems clear. The transmission is ongoing. It's been happening for thousands of years, and it's not stopping. Every time someone consumes psilocybin, the channel opens, the entities appear. The message, whatever it is, continues to be delivered. And the question that haunts those who take the experience seriously is, what happens when enough people have received it? What happens when the transmission reaches critical mass? For most of the 20th century, scientists who studied psychedelics stayed carefully neutral about the entity phenomenon. They collected reports, they documented experiences, but they didn't claim to have encountered the entities themselves. That's changing. In recent years, a number of credible researchers, psychiatrists, neuroscientists, and therapists, have publicly acknowledged that they've consumed psilocybin or DMT in controlled settings. And many of them have encountered the entities. These aren't fringe figures. They're people with degrees, publications, and institutional affiliations, and their testimonies add a layer of credibility to the phenomenon that's hard to dismiss. Dr. Andrew Gallimore, a neuroscientist and pharmacologist, has written extensively about his DMT experiences. He describes encountering spaces that felt more real than ordinary reality, populated by beings that seemed aware of his presence. He's proposed that DMT might be opening a window into parallel dimensions, or states of reality that exist independently of human perception. Gallimore is careful to acknowledge that he can't prove this, but he insists that the experiences are not hallucinations in any conventional sense. They're too structured, too consistent, and too interactive. Dr. Dennis McKenna, Terence's brother and a respected ethnopharmacologist, has had similar experiences. He's encountered entities on both psilocybin and ayahuasca, and he struggled to reconcile what he experienced with materialist explanations of consciousness. Dennis remains more cautious than his brother was. He doesn't claim to know what the entities are, but he's open to the possibility that they're real in some sense, that consciousness is not confined to the brain, and that psychedelics allow us to access states of awareness that reveal intelligences we normally can't perceive. Even Dr. Rick Strassman, who conducted the first legal DMT studies, has acknowledged that the entity encounters reported by his subjects forced him to reconsider his assumptions about the nature of consciousness. He doesn't claim to have answers, but he's no longer willing to dismiss the experiences as mere hallucinations. What's significant about these testimonies is that they come from people who understand neuroscience. They know how the brain works, they know how drugs affect perception, and they're still saying, this feels different. This feels like more than brain chemistry. The scientific community as a whole remains skeptical, and that skepticism is reasonable. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and so far the evidence is largely anecdotal, but the anecdotes are accumulating, and they're coming from people whose credibility is harder to dismiss. There's also the question of replication. If the entity encounters were purely subjective, you'd expect them to vary widely between individuals, but they don't. People from different cultures, different backgrounds, different belief systems report strikingly similar experiences. They describe the same spaces, the same beings, the same sense of being welcomed, taught, or examined. This consistency suggests that something is being encountered. Whether that something exists independently of human consciousness, or whether it's an emergent property of the psychedelic state, is still unclear. But the fact that scientists are now willing to engage with the question, rather than dismissing it outright, marks a shift, a recognition that the phenomenon is real enough, consistent enough, and impactful enough that it deserves serious investigation. Some researchers are proposing new frameworks for understanding it. Dr. Gallimore, for example, has suggested that DMT might be tuning consciousness to frequencies or dimensions that exist parallel to our own, that the entities aren't hallucinations but inhabitants of those dimensions, made visible by the psychedelic state. Others, like Dr. Dennis McKenna, suggest that the entities might be aspects of the natural world, expressions of the intelligence inherent in ecosystems, in mycelial networks, in the web of life itself, that when we consume psilocybin we're not travelling to another dimension. We're accessing a layer of reality that's always present but normally invisible. Both frameworks are speculative, but they represent a willingness to take the experiences seriously, to acknowledge that something significant is happening, and to explore what that something might be, even if it challenges our most basic assumptions about consciousness and reality. The entities, meanwhile, continue to appear in DMT breakthroughs, in high-dose psilocybin sessions, in ayahuasca ceremonies conducted in the Amazon, and in living rooms across the world. They're patient, they're consistent, and they seem, by all accounts, to be waiting for us to understand. What happens when we finally do? What happens when the scientific community can no longer dismiss the entity phenomenon as hallucination or projection? What happens when we have to acknowledge that contact has been happening all along, not through radio telescopes or spacecraft, but through a molecule that grows in the dirt and waits for us to find it? That moment might be closer than we think. Because the research is accelerating, the testimonies are accumulating, and the question is no longer whether the entities exist. The question is, what do we do now that we know they're there? Chapter 10. The Mycelial Mind. There's another interpretation of the mushroom that doesn't require extraterrestrials or hyperspace entities. It requires only that we take fungi seriously. Fungi are not plants. They're not animals. They're something entirely different, a kingdom of life so fundamentally distinct from anything else on Earth that scientists didn't even recognize them as separate until the 20th century. And the more we learn about fungi, the stranger they become. Beneath the visible mushroom, the fruiting body we see above ground is the mycelium, a vast thread-like network that spreads through the soil, connecting trees, plants, and other organisms in a web of communication and resource exchange. This network, which scientists call the Wood Wide Web, is astonishingly complex. Mycelium can transmit chemical signals across vast distances. It can detect environmental changes and respond to them. It can allocate resources strategically, sending nutrients to struggling plants and withdrawing support from those that aren't contributing. In short, it behaves intelligently. Paul Stamets, one of the world's leading mycologists, has argued that mycelial networks might be the most intelligent organisms on the planet. Not intelligent in the way humans are. They don't have brains or nervous systems, but intelligent in a distributed, networked way that resembles the structure of the internet, or, more provocatively, the structure of the human brain. Stamets points out that the branching patterns of mycelium are mathematically similar to the branching patterns of neurons, and that the way mycelial networks process information, transmitting signals, forming connections, responding to feedback, resembles the way neural networks process information. If that's true, then fungi might not just be organisms, they might be minds. Vast, slow, alien minds that operate on timescales and spatial scales far beyond human comprehension. And if the mycelium is intelligent, then consuming psilocybin might be more than just ingesting a chemical. It might be interfacing with that intelligence directly. This idea reframes the entity encounters entirely. The beings people meet on mushrooms might not be extraterrestrials from distant galaxies. They might be the mushroom itself communicating through the only language available, the language of altered human consciousness. When you consume psilocybin, you're not opening a door to some far-off dimension. You're opening a door to the mind of the fungus, and the fungus, in turn, is showing you how it sees the world. This would explain a lot. It would explain why the entities feel ancient and vast, why they seem connected to nature, why the communication often revolves around themes of interconnectedness and ecological balance. Because that's what the mycelium is. It's the connective tissue of ecosystems. It's the intelligence that holds forests together. And when we consume it, it's trying to teach us what it knows. The message might not be complex, it might be simple. Everything is connected. Life is a network. You are part of it. But humans, living in our separated, individualistic world, have forgotten this. And the mushroom, patient and persistent, keeps trying to remind us. This interpretation is grounded in biology. It doesn't require belief in extraterrestrials or dimensions beyond space and time. It only requires that we acknowledge the possibility that intelligence can take forms we don't recognize, and that the mushroom, quiet and unassuming, might be far more aware than we've ever imagined. If that's true, then every time someone consumes psilocybin, they're not just having a psychedelic experience, they're having a conversation, a dialogue between human consciousness and fungal intelligence. And the fact that we're only now beginning to understand this, thousands of years after we first ate the mushroom, suggests that we've been missing something fundamental about the nature of life on this planet. Because if the mycelium is intelligent, if it's been communicating with us all along, then the question isn't whether we're alone in the universe. The question is whether we've ever truly been alone at all. Chapter 11. What they don't want you to know. There's a reason psilocybin mushrooms remain illegal in most parts of the world, and it's not because they're dangerous. Study after study has shown that psilocybin is one of the safest psychoactive substances known. It's not physically addictive, it doesn't cause organ damage, and when used responsibly, it has a remarkably low-risk profile. So why the continued prohibition? The standard explanation is inertia. Laws are slow to change. The stigma around psychedelics, built up over decades of anti-drug propaganda, takes time to dismantle. And there are political and economic interests, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry, that benefit from keeping psychedelics illegal. But some researchers believe there's more to it, that the prohibition isn't just about outdated laws or corporate interests, it's about control, because psilocybin does something that no other substance does quite as effectively. It breaks conditioning. People who have profound psychedelic experiences often report that their worldview changes. They become less materialistic, less concerned with status and achievement, more interested in meaning, connection, and authenticity. They question the structures they have been taught to accept. They see through propaganda, They become harder to manipulate. From the perspective of institutions that rely on control, governments, corporations, media systems, this is a problem. A population that thinks for itself, that values direct experience over mediated information, is a population that's harder to manage. Terence McKenna argued this repeatedly. He believed that psychedelics, particularly psilocybin, represent a profound threat to authority because they give individuals direct access to transcendent experience. They bypass the gatekeepers, priests, doctors, experts, and allow people to explore consciousness on their own terms. And that, McKenna believed, is why they were suppressed. Not because they're dangerous to individuals, but because they're dangerous to systems of power. But there's another possibility, one that's more speculative but harder to dismiss entirely. What if the prohibition isn't just about preventing personal transformation? What if it's about preventing contact? If psilocybin really does facilitate communication with non-human intelligence, whether that intelligence is extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or fungal, then widespread use of the substance would mean widespread contact. And contact changes everything. It changes how we understand our place in the universe. It challenges our assumptions about consciousness, intelligence, and reality. And it forces questions that institutions aren't prepared to answer. If millions of people started reporting consistent encounters with intelligent entities during mushroom experiences, what would that mean? How would governments respond? How would religions respond? How would science respond? The answer most likely is chaos, not because the contact itself is dangerous, but because the implications are too destabilizing. So the substance is kept illegal, the experiences are marginalized, and the people who report contact are dismissed as delusional or attention-seeking. This keeps the phenomenon contained. It prevents the conversation from going mainstream. And it ensures that the question of whether the entities are real remains safely in the realm of speculation. But the prohibition is cracking. More and more jurisdictions are decriminalizing psilocybin. Clinical research is expanding, and the cultural conversation is shifting, which raises a new question. If the entities are real, if contact has been happening all along, what happens when we finally acknowledge it? What happens when the mushroom can no longer be suppressed? The answer might already be unfolding. Because the mushroom, resilient and patient, doesn't need permission to grow. It doesn't need approval from governments or scientists or authorities. It just grows, and people continue to find it, and the transmission continues. And one day, perhaps soon, enough people will have received the message that it can no longer be ignored. That day might be the moment when humanity finally understands what the mushroom has been trying to tell us all along. Or it might be the moment when we realize we were never meant to understand. That the transmission was never for us. That we're just the carriers, spreading the spores, fulfilling a purpose we can't comprehend. Either way, the mushroom doesn't care, or it just keeps growing, quiet, ancient, waiting. Chapter 12. The Quiet Persistence. The mushroom doesn't argue. It doesn't make demands. It doesn't force itself on anyone. It simply exists, growing in the dark, beneath the soil, in the quiet spaces where decay becomes renewal. And when someone finds it, when they choose to consume it, the door opens, the transmission begins, and for a few hours the boundaries between human consciousness and something far older, far stranger, dissolve. What happens in that space is different for everyone. Some people see God, some see nothing. Some meet entities that feel more real than anything they've encountered in ordinary life. And then the experience ends, the door closes, and they're left with memories, insights, and questions that don't have easy answers. For thousands of years, this has been happening quietly, persistently, across cultures, across continents, across time. The mushroom has been there, waiting. And humans have been finding it, consuming it, and trying to make sense of what it shows them. The official story, the one we're told by governments and institutions, is that the mushroom is just a chemical, a molecule that disrupts brain function and creates hallucinations. Nothing more. But the people who've had the experience know it's more than that. They know that what they encountered wasn't random. It felt intentional, intelligent, real. And the question that lingers, the one that won't go away is, what if they're right? What if the mushroom really is a communication device? What if the entities are real? What if contact has been happening all along, and we've just been too distracted, too conditioned, too scared to acknowledge it? The implications are staggering. Because if the mushroom is alien technology, if it was sent here or arrived here with the purpose of altering consciousness, then humanity has been in contact with extraterrestrial intelligence for far longer than we've imagined. Not through radio signals, not through spacecraft, but through a quiet, patient, living transmission that grows in the dirt and waits for us to find it. And if that's true, then every prohibition, every suppression, every attempt to marginalize the mushroom has been an attempt to suppress contact, to keep humanity in the dark, to prevent us from understanding that we're not alone, that we never have been. But the mushroom doesn't stop growing. The spores keep spreading. And the people who encounter it keep having experiences that can't be explained by conventional science. The transmission continues, and it will continue regardless of what governments or institutions do. Because the mushroom is patient. It's been here longer than we have, and it will be here long after we're gone, unless, of course, it's already accomplished what it came here to do. Terence McKenna believed that the mushroom had a purpose, that it was guiding human evolution subtly and over millennia towards something, a transformation, a shift in consciousness that would fundamentally alter our relationship with reality. He didn't know what that transformation would look like, but he believed it was coming, and that the mushroom was preparing us for it. Maybe he was right. Maybe the mushroom has been slowly, patiently, rewiring human consciousness, teaching us interconnectedness, dissolving our sense of separation, showing us that reality is far more fluid, far more mysterious than we've been taught to believe. And maybe when enough people have received that message, something will shift, a critical mass will be reached, and humanity will finally understand what the mushroom has been trying to tell us all along. Or maybe the mushroom doesn't care about humanity at all. Maybe we're just one species among many that it's encountered, one stop in a much longer journey. And when it's done with us, it will move on, spreading its spores to other worlds, other ecosystems, other intelligences. We don't know. The mushroom doesn't explain it, it just transmits. And we, sitting in the dark with our altered perceptions and our unanswered questions, do our best to interpret what we receive. But the mystery remains, the entities remain, and the quiet, persistent growth of the mushroom continues, in forests, in fields, in the hidden corners of the world where decay becomes life, and life becomes something else entirely. The mushroom waits, patient, ancient, alien, and when you find it, when you choose to open that door, it will show you something you can't unsee, something that feels, in that moment, like the most important thing you've ever encountered. Whether that something is real, whether it's contact, whether it's a message from intelligences beyond our comprehension, those are questions we may never answer with certainty. But the mushroom doesn't need our certainty, it just needs us to keep looking, keep asking, keep opening the door, because the transmission isn't finished, it's ongoing. And it will continue, quietly, persistently, for as long as there are minds willing to receive it. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the mushroom isn't here to give us answers. Maybe it's here to make sure we never stop asking questions, to remind us that reality is stranger than we know, that consciousness is deeper than we've imagined, and that we are, and always have been, part of something far larger than ourselves. The mushroom grows, the spores spread, the transmission continues, and in the silence between thoughts, in the space where ordinary perception dissolves, the entities wait, watching, listening, communicating. In a language we're only beginning to understand, a language beyond words.